warm welcome to tonight's talk, or today's talk, depending on where you're joining us from. I am Shirley Gilbert. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London here in the United Kingdom. And I'm also the director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established 7 years ago in memory of the late British historian, of whom I have no relation. Sir Martin, of course, will be well known, I'm sure, to many of you. He was the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill and also wrote very prolifically on a wide range of topics, including the world wars, the history of Israel, and the modern Jewish experience. And so the focus for our public-facing talks program, of which this talk forms a part, are those subjects that Sir Martin spent his life exploring. And we're really focused on and interested in reaching a wide non-academic public and bringing the best of academic historical research to that public. In addition to these kinds of talks, we also do a schools program. We work with secondary schools across the UK, creating resources based on primary materials and the latest historical scholarship to try and feed that into work with young people as well. And all of our events are free at the point of access. So we always very warmly welcome any donations you feel that you would like to give or feel able to give. It's very easy to donate on our website if you would like to check that out. Tonight, I am very, very happy to be able to introduce Professor Tom Weber, who is Professor of History and International Affairs and founding director of the Center of Global Security and Governance at the University of Aberdeen. But in addition to this position at Aberdeen, Tom's affiliations are very impressive and international. He's also a visiting fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's an associate fellow of the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn. He is a senior associate of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School for Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, from where he joins us today. And he is a member of the Security History Network at Utrecht University. He has wide-ranging expertise in European, international, and global political history from the 19th century through to the present. And so we are very privileged and delighted to have Tom with us today. As usual, the talk format will be that Tom will speak for about 40 minutes. After that, we'll open up the floor for your questions and comments. Feel free to post those in the chat, either to everybody or just to me, and I will put them to Tom, or certainly you can put your hands up as well if you would like to ask them afterwards. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Tom for his talk, which is titled Democratic Collapse and Survival in 1933, Takeaways for the 21st Century. And I can think of no more apt topic for us to be discussing. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you so much. Well, I wish we didn't have to explore takeaways for 1933 for the present, but it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you. And thank you so much for the invitation. Now let me just share my screen. So I'd like to start with a now famous speech that Adolf Hitler gave in January of 1932, so about a year before Hitler came to power. The speech is generally known today more for to whom he spoke rather than what he said, because this was when he for the first time was really admitted by German business captains, by the business elite of Germany. And the story of the speech is normally now is about the failure of German elites. It's about how German elites paved the way to power for Adolf Hitler. It is, of course, absolutely correct to look at the speech in this way as well. It's done quite rightly so, because from then on, industrialists and old elites began to support Adolf Hitler and became the gravediggers of democracy and civilization. But what is equally important, and what's normally not done, is to look at what he said that night in Düsseldorf. For instance, he said, "Because I think it is important, above all, to fundamentally break with the view that our fate is determined by the world. It is not true that our misery has its ultimate cause in a world crisis, in a world catastrophe, but it is true that we were plunged into a general crisis because certain mistakes were made in our country from the outset. He also said, in my opinion, the view that the world crisis is solely to blame must lead to dangerous pessimism. Indeed, the central focus that evening was a world at crisis, or the world crisis, die Weltkrise. Today we might say, he would say polycrisis or permacrisis. And in order to make sense of the world crisis or the polycrisis of his day, he was trying to identify the reasons for that crisis and who were responsible for them. He was precisely saying this is not just a crisis that came out of nowhere, but it is one that was being produced. And it is in that context that he really started to identify Jews as the originators of that crisis. But he also always looked at the failure, what he saw the failure of the German government and even of ordinary Germans, so that Jews could get that kind of influence. So it's important that he is blaming really Jews, the government, and the Germans themselves. And it is a message that at that time he was repeating time and time again. So, for instance, for his New Year's message at the end of 1932, a month before he came to power, he said, "For Germany is today the country first and most affected by this world crisis." What Hitler was motivated by during that time, but arguably even earlier, is on how to overcome that crisis and how to restore security. The restoring security, in a way, really goes back to day one of his politicization, radicalization in the aftermath of World War I, when Hitler was trying to identify what he thought were the underlying reasons for Germany's weakness. So why Hitler really wanted to try to make sense why Germany could lose this war, the First World War, but also how Germany could survive in a world of rapidly changing world where he thought that only super empires or superpowers would survive. And there he really tried to identify the reasons for that weakness, which he saw both structural, but also more immediately as a result of this crisis, which he believed was the greatest crisis since at least the Middle Ages. He was moving around between saying for 2,000 years, for hundreds of years since the Middle Ages, but ultimately he presents crisis ever since the 1920s as a do or die crisis. And I believe that this is actually also, even though this is not quite the topic for today, is one of the missing links in understanding Hitler's drive towards eliminationist anti-Semitism. So, for instance, in this article where we see a snapshot from the Journal of Anti-Semitism Studies, I present utilitarian functional drive between Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism. I argue there that Hitler's political and proto-genocidal anti-Semitism was a function of the existential anxiety he felt about what he perceived to be the greatest polycrisis, permacrisis, world crisis, you name it, in centuries, and his ensuing quest for sustainable security. Regaining that security lay at the center of his politicization and radicalization, as well as of all his actions once in power. As I contend, three ingredients had to come together to produce Hitler's genocidal anti-Semitism. First, an awareness of, belief in, and anxiety about the existence of an existential, national, and international all-encompassing crisis. Second, a linking of Jews to that crisis. And third, a translation of that link into a program of total solutions and a quest for sustainable security. The goal of that anti-Semitism was to overcome a life or death mega crisis in order to be able to return subsequently to conventional pursuit of security. It was not to produce permanent security for eternity. And interestingly, also, Hitler presents that challenge, not just as a German challenge, but as an all-European challenge to overcome that crisis. Even in January of 1945, for his last big anniversary speech given on each year on the anniversary of Hitler's seizure of power, he still spoke of, quote, the gravest crisis in Europe in many centuries, which had started in 1918 and would supposedly lead to the annihilation of all states that would not organize themselves as Volksgemeinschaften, as communities of the people that possess a clear orientation and that ideologically fortified and that drive out the agents of that crisis and the originators. And those originators were for him Jews. They were the agents of the greatest existential crisis for hundreds of years. But again, they could only, Hitler believed, become a problem because of the failure of successive German governments and the sins of ordinary Germans. The solution for him was to set up a new political system, to set up a political system with a government that he saw fit for purpose to overcoming crisis, and also to embark on genocide. The reason why I'm mentioning this all here is because I think it is in this crisis awareness that we can see similarities between the interwar years and today. The belief to be encountering not just any crisis, but to encounter a do or die crisis, an existential crisis. And I think looking at how crisis perception is a driver for radicalization and political breakdown is a better question than the question that we often ask when people look at, for instance, in the US context, Weimar America and make Trump-Hitler comparisons and so on. I still think you should read the book On the Left, Fascism in America. I think it's a good book, and I was privileged enough to write a chapter there for myself. So this is not an easy shot at looking at resurgent fascism and so on. But I think the problem is that we look too much at the consequences, at the product of political breakdown. So we try to compare the end products. And I think asking, is Hitler or Trump, is not a particularly useful question, but looking at the underlying drivers that make political breakdown possible, I think is more fruitful. So that's also the point of this book, that so far has only come out in German, but we hope also will come out soon, which is this book On the Left, Als die Demokratie starb, When Democracy Died, the seizure of power by the National Socialist, history and present, for which I assembled, I think, about 15 different authors, and where we were trying to look at lessons of 1933 for the present, but where we were particularly indeed looking at, for instance, the role of crisis perception. We also looked at cases of, and I'll get back to that, on countries in which democracy survived in 1933 to ask whether they maybe provide better lessons. As I said, so far the book is only out in English, but since we wrote, sorry, in German, as we wrote the book in English, I'm hopeful that soon it will also be out in English. Anyway, so what 1933 matters, not least because of the perception of the time of living in the greatest crisis in centuries, which arguably helped to pave the way to the death of democracy and the collapse of Europe in the 1930s, not only in Germany, but it is exemplified by the breakdown in Germany. And it is with crisis and crisis perception that is one of the reasons why we should deal with 1933. And maybe less so because of that, for instance, last year there was an anniversary. I think particularly, I mean, this is maybe more so more pertinent point to make in Germany than in this context. In Germany, there is this tradition now with either book publishing or in terms of anniversary public events is to very much always kind of look ahead. What are the next anniversaries for the next 5 years, and then kind of celebrate them or commemorate them. And there is some point in this, but I think at the end, but sometimes what gets a little bit lost is why exactly this is being done. And what we see here are two illustrations of crisis perception in the interwar years and today. The crisis perception in interwar Europe also preceded the world economic crisis of the late 1920s. There was for instance, we'll see at the top, a Google Ngram of how the word Krise or crisis in German was being used between 1900 and 1950. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Google Ngrams, what Google Ngram does is you can look at the frequency a word is being used in all books that have been digitized by Google. And from that we can actually see this kind of phenomenal rise of the way that people talked about crisis in Germany. It also, by the way, happened in other European countries, but interestingly, so at least for the languages for which you can run Google Ngram searches, it's more pronounced in Germany than anywhere else. In Germany, the frequency went up by 750%, while in English and French and Spanish, it went up by only 250%. So what we'll see here is the rise of crisis as a state of being, of an all-encompassing crisis, and I would argue we're living again in a world of this kind. For instance, we see this at the bottom. At Davos last year, the big buzzword was polycrisis, and there are many other reasons, or there are many other ways to show that in recent years, the successive crises that have occurred in recent years, whether it be the 2008 financial crisis, the corona or COVID crisis, other financial crises, and so on, that in the mind of many, they have coalesced into one phenomenon. It's seen as just a permanent crisis. Is in the eyes of many, the world is out of joint. So it is therefore also useful to look at how countries between the two world wars dealt with the perceived crisis of the world at the time, in the hope of discovering lessons for the present on how to create resilient political system and societies. But again, this is not just about looking at everything that's going badly. In many ways, the problem is that we as scholars, or we as societies, we're so prone in studying breakdown, and obviously it's more interesting, or maybe not obviously, it's more interesting to write about revolutions, about wars, how things blow up, than to look at repair, in the same way that people rather watch a James Bond movie than some family drama where everyone will hug each other at the end of the day. But the problem is arguably that as a result of that, we don't really know sufficiently the success factors of resilience and of repair after conflict. And of course, it's also, I mean, with repair after conflict, at least you can really study a phenomenon where things are happening, while with resilience, you sometimes have got to study the absence of something, which is, of course, methodologically far more difficult. but arguably still worthwhile doing in order to understand better what the success factors for resilience and of repair after conflict are. And one thing that we did in the book was include a chapter on the Netherlands in 1933, or should really say in interwar Europe, written by the Dutch historian Beatrice de Graaf. And I'm presenting today a little bit from that chapter and more broadly from the case of the Netherlands, but it is only a case study here. This is not all about the comparison of Germany and the Netherlands. In fact, when a few times I've given talks of this kind before, people have said afterwards, well, but Germany and the Netherlands are really quite different. Germany did not, the Netherlands did not experience defeat in the war, and so on and so forth. And yeah, that is absolutely true. But the point is less to directly compare the two countries, but rather to be aware that in interwar Europe, in 60% of countries, democracy died, while in 40% it survived. And to see Germany and the Netherlands as part of those spectrum of countries, and the point is to identify countries in which, from a perspective of 1920 or even 1930, as if you look forward, it was indeterminate whether or not democracy would survive. Arguably, there were some countries in which democratic survival was, the chances of democratic survival were very high, while with others, maybe it was extremely bad. But the case here would be that these are two countries, and one could add, for instance, France, where it was indeterminate, undecided whether or not democracy would survive. And doing so allows us two things. It allows us to test some of our lessons that we have drawn from cases of democratic breakdown, which are based on cases, particularly like Germany, where things did break down. And secondly, to look at what resilience looks like. And just one more word, while it is actually important to look at the identifying the success factors of resilience. The reason for this is particularly if you do not just study the past, but you are trying to think about lessons for the present or the future. The problem is that disasters, even man-made ones, or human-made ones, I should say, are notoriously difficult to predict. And the success factors of disasters are hard to figure out. Looking at specific cases of the collapse of civilizations, including the collapse of Weimar democracy, carries therefore double danger, which is that the most important variables for the emergence of specific cases of collapse are insufficiently identified, and that too narrow conclusions are drawn. The exact historical context of the collapse of political order will always be different. The perception of an existential polycrisis and its political consequences will be as well. This is why it is so useful to identify states and societies from the past that were resilient or even anti-fragile to the widest possible range of shocks. This is why looking at democratic survival in countries such as the Netherlands in 1933 provides as much inspiration for overcoming the challenges facing liberal democracy today as looking at the collapse of democracy in countries like Germany. I just mentioned a second ago that what, however, also is possible by looking at cases in which democracy did not die is actually to test some of the normative conclusions that we have drawn from the collapse of democracy in Germany and other countries. And doing so allows us to identify how we often have fallen into the post hoc propter ergo hoc trap. So which in straight English basically means that we look at we see causation between things that that merely have followed each other chronologically, but where there is not necessarily a causal link, but because they have followed after each other, and because maybe it was plausible or reasonable that there would be some causal link, we've jumped to the conclusion that there is a causal link to learn lessons from the failure of Weimar. Time and again, we have claimed or at least overemphasized causal connections between phenomena that followed one another in a temporal sense. So by comparing countries like the Netherlands and other countries with Germany, we can test the common explanations as we know them from textbooks. One example would be the impact of the world economic crisis. We often read about the consequences of the world economic crisis in Germany. And obviously here, this is not an all or nothing. I'm not saying the world economic crisis did not matter. Obviously it mattered, but it was not just the severity that mattered. It was the combination of the severity of the economic crisis and pre-existing conditions, which meant that Germany was insufficiently resilient to that kind of economic crisis, because the world economic crisis was in its economic and social impact in the USA comparable, and in the Netherlands almost comparable. And yet the political consequences stood a world apart. This becomes even clearer at falling to this kind of trap if we look at the common views, conventional views about the fragmentation of German politics in interwar Germany. So normative conclusions have been drawn from the fact that there were just so many parties in the German parliament in the interwar years, and that supposedly no longer majorities could be formed because of that, that the center of politics eroded. And as a result of that, in a 5% hurdle was being introduced in Germany, in West Germany, as the West German state was formed in the late 1940s, which basically means, of course, that a party has got to get at least 5% of the votes in order to make it into parliament, to limit the number of parties in parliament. And people to the present day in Germany will say that you really do need to do this to safeguard democracy. But if you look at interwar Germany into the Netherlands, you actually see that the Netherlands and Germany had almost exactly the same electoral system. And with the result that the Reichstag, which we see in the top right-hand side, and the second chamber of the Dutch parliament, which you see on the bottom right, had almost exactly the same number of parties. They were, I think, between 15 and 20 parties, depending on, no, I think 13 and 17 parties, depending on the exact election in the interwar years. And yet, in the Netherlands, the political center held, functioning coalitions could still be formed, and democracy survived. And even today, there are 20 parties in the second chamber of the Dutch parliament, and Mark Rutte, who's of course outgoing, but nevertheless, he has been the longest serving head of government in the EU, despite this electoral system. But let's look at less at these traps, but let's look more about the resilience of some political systems. And one is indeed to look at the behavior of interwar conservatism and their attitudes towards democracy, and more broadly, of the traditional elites of the country towards democracy. As a chapter that we saw a minute ago by Beatrice de Graaf in Als die Demokratie starb suggests, the survival of democracy in the Netherlands is not primarily due to a chain of coincidences. Democracy in the Netherlands was Janus-faced as well. It had a repressive character, and contingencies also played a big role for democratic survival. But the point is rather to show here the historical case of a state that managed to establish systems that were, relatively speaking, but not absolutely so, more resilient than those of many of its competitors, thereby reducing the likelihood of a catastrophic collapse of democracy. In the Netherlands, we saw parties and traditional elites that saw a spirit of moderation as a guarantor of their own political survival. So they bought into democracy, not necessarily because they all love democracy, but because ultimately they saw their future in democracy. And that therefore, for instance, in the Netherlands, the political elite and the royal house and so on, they were presenting people who stood against democracy as dishonorable. They were trying to ostracize them. See a bit more how this was done in a minute. As a result of that, it was more difficult for them to grow. Well, contrast that with the German case, in which the traditional elite did not see its future in democracy. They did not see their own survival being guaranteed in there, and therefore did quite to the contrary, to ostracizing them or to making them dishonorable. They made common ground with the enemies of democracy. And again, actually, to illustrate that this is not just a case of a Western European country with a long democratic tradition versus Germany, is even within Germany, there's this fascinating difference between the elites in northern Germany and Prussia and those in Bavaria. In Bavaria, of course, the initially elites really burned their fingers or their hands when they initially thought that supporting or allowing the National Socialist Party to emerge in Bavaria, even to make common ground with them in 1923, that it was a good idea. But then they realized that they'd really burned their fingers, and after that, they kept their distance. Traditional elites, even though they would also not necessarily totally love democracy, they bought into Weimar democracy, as a result of which the traditional party of Bavarian conservatism, the BBP, remained strong. It remained the strongest political party, while in northern Germany, it just collapsed. This is also a point more broadly here about how conservative parties positioned themselves, but also what their organizational strength. And that's also a point that the Harvard political scientist Daniel Ziblatt, who also contributed a chapter to the book, made in his own book, Parties and the Birth of Democracy, where he actually shows that there was no real buy-in in Germany, but also, maybe more importantly, that the Conservative Party in Germany was organizationally weak, and therefore could actually ultimately almost break up in 1928, and therefore create the conditions that would allow National Socialism to grow, while that space simply did not exist elsewhere in other countries, to the extent, obviously it exists in other countries, but in countries in which democracy survived. And even, as I indicated, between 1923 and 1933, that limited the degree to which democracy National Socialism could grow. But let's look a little bit more at the elements of this, what one called wehrhafte or militant democracy avant les lettres in the Netherlands. So above all, we see the outlines of a state there that was able to deal with specific threats to democracy. The Dutch elite had, out of self-interest, again, not necessarily for a love of democracy, out of self-interest, established a resilient political structure that was capable of dealing with a wide range of shocks to its systems. Secondly, it had created a system that was able to react flexibly to new crises. The Netherlands had thus created a defensive democracy avant les lettres, or a militant democracy avant les lettres, excelling in both crisis prevention and crisis response, characterized by an internal and flexible resilience to unrest and any kind of extremism. The country had taken security precautions to identify and proactively suppress extremist tendencies of any kind. In doing so, they took both a proactive and a reactive approach, aiming to prevent crises, but also to respond quickly and often intelligently when they did break out. For example, the Dutch government introduced a ban on wearing uniforms in public to get Nazi sympathizers off the streets and signal that their behavior was indecent. It also banned state employees from joining or becoming involved in extremist organizations. The aim was not to silence political ideologies, but to maintain order and calm in general. The ban was skillfully enforced, only selectively and flexibly, so that extreme ideological positions could continue to be expressed as long as they did not boil over. In this way, the activities of extremists were contained at the margins before they could penetrate the center of politics. The firewall stood, and it was a firewall against many different types of fires and arsonists. The Dutch did not need to anticipate the specific threats of 1933 and beyond, as the Dutch crisis prevention and response capacities were large enough to deal with a wide range of challenges and threats, enabling democratic survival. For this reason, maybe a country like the Netherlands of the interwar period holds better lessons for the present than that of democratic collapse in Germany during the same time. And also note that at the beginning of the Corona crisis, it was countries that were that as a result of existential threats like Taiwan and Israel had built up flexible crisis response capabilities that allowed the countries to, at least initially, respond to the crisis better than other countries. But as further proof, and actually here I want to again look at how today we are facing the challenge of political breakdown, again, as a result of crisis perception. And here I want to look at the crisis perception and radicalization nexus. Namely that there is a link between the crisis perception between crisis then and now, above all in terms of political radicalization. One example is, and that's just an extreme example, is the that strange failed coup in Germany in late 2022, the Reichsbürger coup of this bizarre prince. What actually got lost in the reporting about that is to look how people themselves, how some of the leading actors of that coup, how they perceived the world. I looked at some of these ego documents, and what quickly becomes clear from that is that they also think that they live in a world of crisis. So for instance, one of them even wrote a self-published book about crisis, and that politicians no longer know how to respond to crisis. So here we also have got this idea we're living in a world of crisis, and they, the politicians, our governments, don't know what it takes in order to respond to these crises and to ensure our collective survival. And in a way, even though the Corona crisis, COVID crisis is over now, in a way we're now really, I would argue, deal with the delayed impact of both the COVID crisis, political impact of the COVID crisis, as well as of other crises. What we also know from the study of past crises of the last 100 years, it's generally, there's a delayed political impact. In the moment of crisis, people generally come together, and it is only afterwards that there's a political fallout, that people will start to to ask themselves, how could we get into this crisis? And it is really then when people start to lose confidence in their political elites, in their governments. And I would argue that this is also one of the factors that has been fueling the rise of illiberal democracies, and of radical right-wing, and I should also say radical left-wing political movements in Europe and around the world. And in a way, we're actually seeing here something that again is not that dissimilar from the interwar years. It's in that book that we saw earlier, I'm trying to make a case that we should see the National Socialism as a case of illiberal democracy as well. And the reason for this is that I try to look at the self-perception of National Socialists, and that people thought at the time that, I mean, obviously we quite rightly see National Socialists as the very enemies of democracy, but that's not necessarily how the National Socialists saw themselves. And here again, we see another reason why the fall of the Weimar Republic 1933 is a warning of where uncontained perceptions of crisis can lead. After all, it was Hitler's polycrisis consciousness and the associated individual and collective existential fear that formed the core of the emergence of Hitler's political and genocidal anti-Semitism. Added to this was the identification of the Jews with this crisis and the implementation of this identification in a program of total solutions in order to protect themselves in the long term. Here, let me just, I mean, I've gone to almost out of time, so I have to rush through this a little bit. Let me give you a little bit an idea of Hitler's attitudes towards democracy. So we all know about his outbursts of democracy, and here we only have some of those examples. But what we often forget is the extent to which both Hitler as well as the National Socialists also were trying to invoke democracy in a positive way. So Hitler was then referring to democracies as so-called democracies, and we're saying, well, we, the National Socialists, we are the real democracies. With us, there is real rule of the people. And this is sometimes dismissed as just being somehow disingenuous, and he just wanted to get some votes. I think it's more than that. It ultimately goes to the heart of questions of political legitimacy in Adolf Hitler's case, is that Hitler really rejected the idea that the old idea of the old order that that political legitimacy comes from above. That is really something that hardly anyone, at least in Germany, wanted to return to. So this was an idea, basically. Here again, this is to say, well, look, the old world didn't work, and Hitler doesn't believe in it. But interwar democracy didn't work. Look, it got us into this gravest crisis for hundreds of years. So therefore, we need to create something better. We need to change the political leadership, but we also need to come up with better ideas of how to create a better democracy. A true democracy. And again, this really goes back to questions of political legitimacy. Even in his table talks, in his monologues during the Second World War, at times when you think you should deal with what's happening on the Eastern Front, he spends, for instance, one entire evening trying to think about political legitimacy and how in the future leaders, as well as political decisions, how they can be legitimized by the people. So therefore, actually, to conclude, is I see the perception of living in great crises is something that is really connecting the interwar years as well as today. And that is maybe also the most important warning that the past century holds for us is that the biggest and most terrible crisis in the world often arise when we try to contain real or perceived crisis heedlessly. In fact, they were the greatest political crisis of the 20th century were created by those who wanted to contain them. As the Dutch historian whom quoted earlier has put it, the 20th century showed that disasters and risks were not only solved by people, but also produced. The great social engineering projects of the 20th century, fascism, National Socialism, and communism, led to death and destruction on a hitherto unprecedented industrial scale. So do the attempts of the last decades to prevent a repetition of such a crisis need to be renewed or expanded in 2024, at a time when the perception of living in a permanent existential crisis is spreading again? I think the answer is pretty clear if we look at the world around us. There are, of course, many ways on how we can look at policy. For instance, particularly if we look at the role of social media and maybe the lack of governance on social media and how divisive behavior is being fostered through that kind. But maybe we also need to change, all of us, because it's always easy to just to point at political elites and others. It's arguably the breakdown of what one may call the pre-political values, kind of the ordinary virtues, that how we deal with each other is also what holds democracies together. And without those, even the best institutions in the world will not help. We arguably spend far too much time in just looking at institutional setups, rather than to look at the erosion of those pre-political values. Media have become distrust machines. In a way, I'm uneasy to say this because, again, here, and as I'm out of time now, I will not give you the quotes, is in Hitler's 1932 speech. He actually made, and I say this in an uneasy way, he made similar points. He was saying this crisis could only spread because we are without values, because we have lost the values on how we'll deal with each other. But in a way, this shows again, just like with liberal democracy, that people at the time who fell for these political seductions are not so unlike us. They point how easily things can disintegrate and how people will destroy democracy and political values in the name of destroying them. And here we can also ask ourselves on how we deal with trust, empathy, tolerance, moderation, justice, and patience, and not just in politics, but also in society today. So how do we behave with each other? How do we react to the crisis today? Who do we applaud today? What are we doing to maintain a crisis and resilient free world? Are you part of the problem or part of the solution to the challenges that we face today? Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That's a nice challenging point on which to end, and certainly lots of sobering lessons there. The idea that sometimes the greatest crises in history are caused by people who are trying to contain them, I think, is a very sobering thought. I have some questions that have come to me in the chat and that also generally in the chat, but I'm going to start with a question of my own, which I was struck by the mention you made many times of the role of elites in Germany as well as in the Netherlands, both in the breakdown of democracy or conversely in the bolstering of democracy. I think certainly from the vantage point of the United Kingdom, it feels like there's a lot of interest in and focus on the role of elites. I think especially seeing what's happening at campuses and universities worldwide. I'd be curious to hear you say a little bit about where you see elites fitting into the contemporary landscape. Maybe talk about the United States as one example or not, but to what extent do you see elites as undermining democracy versus being more on the forging resilience edge of things?
It's a good question. It's of course also, of course, different elites act differently, and elites in different countries act differently. But having said that, I think part of the problem is that we in universities, we somehow like to just like always study others. We like to look at how, for instance, Donald Trump deals with people, how radical right-wing groups or violent political actors behave. But I don't think we're very good at looking at ourselves. In fact, a senior politician asked me a while ago to when he asked me to talk a little bit about these challenges to him. He asked me precisely about the universities, and he asked me for data, and then actually ultimately said, well, I think the problem is there in the universities, but the problem is no one wants to be the person in academia who studies those kinds of problems within academia, because then you will be not very popular amongst your peers. But I think it is, in a way, this is also was my point at the very end. I think when I said we all are problem of that, I think it's particularly true in academia and on campuses that we're not very good at moderation and at empathy with people with different views. Now, as with regards to political elites, I think what is the case particularly in Britain and in America is that the elites have become more radical than the rest of society, which is maybe a little bit different from other countries, some continental European countries. What's happening in Britain is that people who are, and that has something to do with how people are being selected to standard candidates, either in Britain for parliament or in America, is that the people who select them tend to be more radical than society at large, as a result of which you end up with people in Westminster and Washington, D.C., which are considerably more polarized and radical than society at large. That's a little bit different in countries like Germany or the Scandinavian countries or the Netherlands, where things are a little bit the other way around.
Thank you. Okay, so let's pose some questions from the floor. So the earliest question we had was from Eugene, who asked, what, if any, is the relationship between Adolf Hitler's world crisis and Winston Churchill's earlier use of this phrase in his 5-volume The World Crisis, published between 1923 and 1931, containing his analysis of the First World War?
It's a great question, and I feel now really found out, because it's an obvious question to ask. But if you talk about a crisis and interwar years, the short answer is I don't know. I have to think about it, because I suppose the difference would be that Winston Churchill ultimately sees crisis as something that can be contained through democracy. While Hitler ultimately thinks it can't be contained through democracy. But I suppose, in a way, there's still some, on the levels of perception of what the problem is, there might be some interesting parallels.
Thank you. Another question is, how do you take into account a country's national defense capability when measuring democratic resilience? It seems that the Netherlands hardly had any democratic resilience when considering that Germany so quickly took away their democracy and killed 75% of their Jewish population.
I'm not sure whether I quite understand the question, because I think democratic resilience and military resilience are totally different aspects. I mean, obviously, once a country is being defeated, democratic resilience will collapse. Sorry, at least while under occupation. I'm not sure whether the question is ultimately asking why is the survival, why is the survival rate of Jews in the Netherlands so low compared to other countries under occupation? Does that point to a lack of resilience? I mean, that would be a good question, but I think as some of the newer research has shown, is that the survival rates in the Netherlands have less to do with political ideology of the local population, but more to do with the differences between the Jewish councils in different European countries, and also the different occupation rules by the Germans, as well as the different administrative structures. So in many ways, it was just for the Germans, it was much easier to identify Jews in the Netherlands and round them up than in other European countries.
Mm. So someone else asks about the role of anti-Semitism in all of this. Can you maybe say the place that you see anti-Semitism fitting into the current crisis? I mean, the specific question they posed is, our current perception of crisis going to cause a new Holocaust? But perhaps I'll pose it as a broader question of where anti-Semitism fits into the contemporary crisis as you see it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely see a connection there. I mean, we generally see that in times of crisis and crisis perception, conspiratorial thinking goes up. That is fostering is traditionally, of course, fostering anti-Semitism. Also, people go back in times of crisis to old anti-Semitic explanations to make sense of the problems of their own time. David Nuremberg's argument. And in fact, actually, about 2 years ago, I gave a talk in Jerusalem at a conference on defining anti-Semitism, where I was saying is that this kind of at the time, the in-between zone between something that isn't quite anti-Semitic actions and words that are not quite anti-Semitic, but are also not free of traditional anti-Semitism, was a canary in the coal mine of what would lie ahead. I wished I hadn't been right.
Yeah. Stephen Shaw says, isn't a major difference between now and the 1930s the collapse in Europe of much of the traditional left-wing parties, at least in France and Italy, if not in the UK?
Sure. That's at least true for many countries. Of course, not all left-wing parties in interwar Europe were strong, but of course there is something I ultimately cut out. I mean, an argument that Michael Ignatieff is making in our book is there that for the left, it's just as important whether left-wing parties have a democratic buy-in and actually strengthen democracy, which in the case of, for instance, of Social Democrats was the case, but certainly not of the KPD, the Communist Party in Germany. And here, of course, again, the question is, we should also really ask ourselves critically, which left-wing parties today are part of the solution to strengthen democracies and which are part of the problem.
I'm going to finish with one final question, with apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. There were a lot of them, but thank you for all of those interesting questions. And the final one is, based on the material you presented and what you've researched, what are the key lessons for us in 2024? And you have 1 minute to solve the contemporary crisis and give us all the solutions now, Tom.
Well, I mean, in a way, I suppose the answer is something that I was trying to sketch out at the very end, is that we really need to see how we can strengthen more broadly resilience in society in trying to figure out how we can depolarize people, because I think the fundamental problem is polarization today, and that is something that we need to overcome. There are no obvious and clear, there's not the golden bullet to solve this, but I think one way of doing it would be better governance of the internet, of social media. But more broadly, I think what we really need to do is we need to restore the institutions of civil society. In most Western countries, membership in churches, synagogues, clubs, and so on, they're all are down, and it is general, and people instead meet in very small circles, or in fact do meet online. But it is in those institutions that are eroding, that are collapsing, where these pre-political values are being learned and being kind of spread. And I think we really need to restore that. And for anyone else who wants to ask a question, feel free to email me.
Thank you so much, and I'll certainly pass along all of those emails that are in the chat. Thank you, Tom, for some really thought-provoking material, and I think your message about depolarizing society is certainly one that everyone can agree with. The question of how we do it is, as you say, a very, very big challenge. But thank you once again on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre for taking the time to come and talk with us and share your research and your insights. Thank you to all of you for joining us. A quick reminder of our next talk. We're going to have Dr. Wade Bjorn speaking to us about the Yanovska camp in Lviv, Ukraine, which he describes as probably the most important Holocaust site that most people have never heard of. That's going to be on Monday, the 20th of May at the usual time. You can find information and a booking link on our website. Thank you again, Tom. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Take care. See you soon.
Thank you so much.